Hello and welcome to another episode of the Femininja Project. And I have the most incredible, fascinating guest with me today. I'm so proud to call her my friend. We only met recently, a few months ago, but love this woman to death, and you are too. Her name is Diane Schroeder. She is a TEDx and keynote speaker, writer. Let's stop right now, Ninja Project, and I am so excited to have the most spectacular guest with me today. She's a friend of mine, although I just met her a few months ago. We're kind of like soul sisters. Her name is Diane Schroeder. She is a TEDx and keynote speaker, a leader, writer, podcast host, and former first responder as a third generation firefighter. Thank you, Diane, for your service. She is the CEO and founder of The Fire Inside Her, LLC, a community which helps adventurous midlife humans on their journey of personal growth and self-discovery to achieve a more authentic, joyful, and empowered life through self-care, community, and leadership. Diane, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Cheryl, thank you so much. What a wonderful introduction. I'm very grateful to be here.
Oh, I'm so grateful to have you. Just so the audience knows, the title or the name of your podcast is The Fire Inside Her. And I had the honor of being on her show recently, and it was just such a wonderful experience, and I really appreciate it.
Yes, it was a great conversation. I can't wait to release it.
I know. And actually, just probably about 2 weeks later, it was fairly recently after we did the recording, we met for coffee, and it was a lovely over 2 hour long coffee chat.
It was, and we could have stayed longer.
Of course, but we both had places to go and people to see.
Life gets in the way.
Yes, it does sometimes. So speaking of life getting in the way, your life has been quite a roller coaster,
Yes.
and you have ridden that ride, I consider, with an incredible amount of grace, grit. I don't know how much confidence you had along the way, but just tell us your story. Number one, how you became interested in working as a firefighter.
Okay. Well, going back a long time ago, I grew up, there's not a time in my life that I don't remember being part of the fire service. My grandfather was a firefighter back in New York after he got out
Mm,
of after he came home from World War II. And it was a way for him to reconnect in his own type of community and process a lot of the trauma that he saw.
mm.
And then my dad joined the volunteer fire department where I grew up in the late 60s, and so it was just part of my life. There was a scanner in the living room. We spent holidays at the firehouse. It was just a very family oriented. And to be quite honest, it's how I got to spend time with my dad because he worked a full-time job and then he was at the firehouse. It felt like full time. And so in high school, that's that. What are you going to do with your life? What are you going to do with your life? You need to make a decision. I come from a long line of educated women who were in education, they were teachers. And I didn't really want to be a teacher. And so my grandmother, who was a primary caregiver in my life, was ill with dementia. We didn't know a lot about that in the 90s, but I couldn't imagine leaving her, even though I had applied and was accepted to colleges out of state. It was a really like, what am I going to do? Then the Pope came to town in 1993 for World Youth Day. And it was a mass casualty incident. A bunch of teenagers were dehydrated. It was hot. The resources at the reservoir he was at were overwhelmed. So they did kind of a, can you come help us, to all the local fire departments in the Denver metro area. I got to ride with my dad's department because, I'd just gotten my first responder. I was really feeling myself at the age of 17. And I handed out popsicles and just kind of tried to calm down hysterical teenagers. And I was
Mhm.
hooked. And so I told my dad, I'm going to be a firefighter. And that was the path. So my senior year was spent prepping for that. And then I went to a community college to get my fire science degree and spent 5 years trying to get hired because that's about how long it took, and got
Wow.
hired at 23 years old.
So I'm really curious, what was your father's reaction? Was he just really overwhelmed with pride, or was he like, wait a minute, we need to talk about this?
He told me to lay down until the feeling went away. So he was a salty guy,
Uh-huh.
and didn't really mince words. I wouldn't consider him emotionally intelligent.
Mhm.
And he said he was just worried about me. I had
Mhm.
no like, I was very ignorant to the fact I might be treated differently for being a woman. It was just
Mhm.
not how I was raised. I was raised a tomboy. I was raised to believe I could do anything, well, almost anything. And so he was just really concerned about me.
Mhm.
And in some ways, that propelled me to be like, well, screw you, watch me do it anyway.
Mhm.
And that was kind of, I believe he's passed away since. I believe he was very proud of me. He sometimes
Mhm.
had a hard time expressing that. And we really got to the point where we just didn't talk a lot about work.
Mhm.
He had retired from the fire service in the early 90s. And so things changed a lot by the time I got hired almost 10 years later. And so it wasn't something we really talked about.
Mhm. Well, it's really funny because, I'm from a small steel town in Western Pennsylvania. And at one point, they started hiring women, for office work. And the pay, this was back in, oh my gosh, probably the early to mid 70s. The pay was incredible, the hourly rate. And we were all going, hey, let's just do it. Well, my dad put his foot down. He said, absolutely not. I will
Mhm.
not have my daughters exposed to that kind of environment.
Mhm. Well, the irony to that is I was raised in a very sarcastic household. That was one of our love languages, maybe
Mhm.
not the healthiest. So, like, emotionally and how I would fit in with, being witty and quick to come back, he wasn't worried about that at all.
Mhm. Well,
He was
that wasn't what my dad was worried about. I mean,
well, right.
yeah.
Yeah. It was, and I don't know that he really fully articulated what he was concerned about.
Mhm.
Um, just cuz you don't know what you don't know, but I think there
Mhm.
was that protectiveness of me for sure.
Of course. So you, on the other hand, were thinking, "Hey, I've got the education, I've got, the certification, whatever it is, a little bit of experience here. I'm just going to walk in and they're going to love me."
Yeah, I think there was a little bit of that ignorance and arrogance, that I got this. I
Uh-huh.
totally, and I was introduced to being the only woman when I was going to school for the fire science degree. I
Mhm.
was frequently the only girl in class, and there
Mhm.
were some pretty not kind young men in there that thought they were better than and I was less
Mhm.
than and I couldn't do the job, but I knew I was strong enough. I knew, there's these myths you tell yourself like, "Oh, well, I'm strong enough to do the job." And when you get in the job and in the
Mhm.
profession, you realize you don't do anything alone. Everything's a
Right.
team sport. That's why they send so many of us. So
Mhm.
it was, I was like, "Yeah, I got this. I can do this." And for the most part, I had a great career experience. There were
Mhm.
some bumpy parts for sure. I remember shortly after I got hired, the crew that I was with was pretty salty. They were a lot of fun, a lot of a lot of practical jokes
Mhm.
and good times. And then the battalion chief, when it came time for me to move stations, because when you're on probation, you rotate stations every few
Mhm.
months, he said, normally, I'd send you to station 1, but we already have 2 women there, and I'm not gonna stack a rig with women. And that was a moment where I was like, "Well, that doesn't seem fair, and I don't understand why."
Mhm.
Except I was new, so I just kept my mouth shut and said, "Okay, send me wherever you wanna send me."
So where did he send you?
Oh, he sent me to another station, and it was a horrible experience.
Mm.
The crew was terrible and nasty and mean and just treated me horribly to the point where I was calling my old captain, my first captain in tears saying, "What can I do? Can you help me? Like this isn't about me being able to do the job. They're just mean." And it was
Mhm.
relentless and finally they pulled me out of that station and sent me back to the original station.
Do you think that was their original intent, was to scare you off, scare you away?
I have no idea. They just treated me like crap. I mean, I remember very clearly having a conversation with one of the guys in the kitchen who had a daughter. And I said, how would you feel if your daughter were being treated this way by someone like you? And he goes, I'd never let my daughter get into this profession, sweetheart.
Oh, I love that he ended that statement with sweetheart.
Right. Made it all better.
Right. Right. You know, nice
And
right hook to the face.
exactly, and I mean, I was young, don't get me wrong, I was sassy, and I was like, "I'm not gonna let," so I'd fire back, which was not what you were supposed to do as a new firefighter, so I yet, man, you can only take so much, and I
Mhm.
wasn't stupid, and I wasn't going to be talked down to like that. I guess it was kind of my first lesson in learning how to set boundaries and advocate for myself.
Mhm. And did that lesson translate or transfer into your personal life as well?
No, my personal life was a train wreck for most of my career.
Oh,
I
good.
I tried to keep it separate. I really did. I was like, I have a work bucket and a personal life bucket,
Mhm.
and, I tried not to let them intermingle for a
Mhm.
while, and then, it was really hard because, I it was hard to date in the
Mhm.
fire service, outside of the fire service, because guys were like, "Oh, that's cool, she's a firefighter," and then it was like, that's really not so cool, you work with a bunch of men." And so
Mhm.
then the warning is you know, don't date in the fire service. So I was like, "Alright, I won't date in the fire service." I dated cops.
How'd that
And
work out?
not great. Not great at all. So it was like this parallel. I had like a double life in some ways. And then eventually everything kind of came together and collided and
Mhm.
exploded.
Okay, I'm glad you said that word, exploded, because you did do a TED Talk,
Mhm.
and I listened to it, and I never knew that dynamite was used to stop fires or to fight fires.
Mhm.
You took that image of the dynamite and blowing things up and made it very profound and philosophical and applicable to life. So why don't you share that with the listeners? I think they would love it.
Thank you. Well, so dynamite is used to put out oil well fires.
Mm,
And the way it works is if you have an uncontrolled oil well fire, the theory is you drop big gallons of dynamite and it explodes, and the explosion suffocates the fire, and it puts it out. And so when I was researching for my TED talk, a friend of mine suggested that. He's like, "Well, dynamite puts out fires." And it really what resonated me with that example was the gentleman who invented this had no idea if it would work and kind of courageously was like, "Hey, I have this idea. We could use dynamite to put out the fires. Not sure if it'll work. It's kind of dangerous." But he was thinking outside of the box and really disrupting norms. And that
mhm,
resonated with me because I felt like, "Oh, that's kind of what I do."
mhm,
And taking that label of, how people label you and treat you based on their assumption of you and, kind of blowing that up that you're not a label, you're not what other people think of you, and that your value and what you offer to people is not finite. It's not scarcity. It doesn't go away and it doesn't take away
mhm,
from anyone else.
mhm.
Dynamite's just doing what dynamite does.
So, and I love the way you do definitely think outside of the box. You live your life kind of outside of the box, and nobody's going to control you or tell you what to do, which is one of the many things I love about you. But why do you think that people, and I'm saying especially women, are they accept that. They accept the limitations. They accept being in the box and they don't want to get out of the box because that might be scary.
It is scary. I think part of it goes back to that's what we've been programmed our entire lives. It
Mhm,
goes back to, the patriarchy created to keep us down. There's a certain path, there's a certain, role that women are supposed to play. And if you step out of that role, then you become too much, you become too whatever. And it's not always kind. The world is not always kind to people who disrupt the norms. And I think it's easier, it's safe, right? Our egos keep us safe. Like, oh,
mhm,
we're in our cocoon of safety, may not be
mhm,
happy, may not, may desire more, But man, that it's scary to step out of that comfort zone because you don't know
Mhm.
what's going to happen. And I
Mhm.
think it's also the scarcity mindset that's also programmed into us
Mhm.
that, we have to limit ourselves to play small because when we play small, we make everyone else around us more comfortable.
Well, having said all of that, you certainly have had a series of role models who courageously stepped out of the box.
Hmm. Yes.
So
I call
why don't
them
you tell us about the women in your life who helped influence you?
Oh, there's so many. I call them the generational gifts. We talk a lot
Oh,
about generational trauma and
uh-huh.
absolutely my family, my lineage, it doesn't go very far back to see the trauma that we've experienced and I know that's passed down. And then I also realize that through that trauma those gifts have been passed down.
Mhm.
And so my maternal grandmother, we're Cherokee
Mhm.
and I'm fourth generation, so she would be third generation removed from the Trail of Tears. And so
Wow.
her great 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 grandfather was John Ross, who was the principal chief of the Cherokee Indians and led the Trail of Tears. And he was a Scotsman. Then on her maternal side was Sequoia, who created the Cherokee alphabet. So when she was in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, she was born in the early 1900s, which was a really bumpy time for the Cherokees. They had been promised over and over, okay, we're not going to mess with your land anymore. We're not going to mess with your culture. And then Oklahoma became a state. And they said once again, yeah, you're going to have to fall in line with our rules. So her
Mm.
mom, my great grandmother, had been kicked off a horse and had a traumatic brain injury. And so there were five. Five, so she was one of five.
Mhm.
Her older sister, who was just 14 months older, was in high school at the time, and my grandma was sent away to the Haskell Indian School, which in the early 1900s, the United States government had these schools all over the country that to assimilate indigenous tribes and indigenous children to
Mm.
learn English. They were forbidden to speak their native language. They were forbidden to, have anything to do with their native culture. They were there to learn how to be American. And it was really brutal. My grandma had the benefit. She was there for high school for 4 years. She could read and write. The
Mhm.
Cherokees were very um, driven to make sure education was a priority. So she could read and write. She finished school there. Never, she didn't go back very often to Oklahoma. So
Mhm.
she went out here to Colorado and was a nanny for the dean of Northern Colorado College, got her
Mhm.
degree. And at the same time, her sister was got her master's degree there and was teaching in Arizona. And so my grandma fell in love with my grandpa. The depression hit.
Mm.
They moved back to New York because he had work there. So she went back and she looked much more native than I do.
Mhm.
So this German guy who came out to Colorado to become a preacher, I believe, a minister,
Mhm.
comes back married to a Native American. And
Hmm.
it was a little bumpy.
I'll
So
bet.
she she faced, I think, a lot of discrimination and a lot of
Mhm.
judgment. So she
Mhm.
overcompensated by that. She was pretty cold, as my mom would describe her and her sisters would describe her. She had my aunt, and then my uncle or my grandfather enrolled in World War II. He volunteered. And
Mhm.
so every time he came back on leave, well, the two times he came back on leave, she got pregnant. So she was
Mhm.
basically a single mom living with his parents,
Oh,
raising three young girls.
okay. Let me
And
let me just interrupt for a minute. Oh gosh, what was the question that what I was wondering? Oh, is that as you described in your talk, your TED talk, was that the scary grandma?
yes, yes.
Okay.
So she was pretty intense. I guess that's she was cold
Mhm.
and I didn't understand why. I didn't get to see her a lot growing up because they
Mhm.
lived on the East Coast. And my mom just wanted to get as far away from her as possible when
Mm.
she was 18 years old. So it all tracks and makes sense.
Mhm.
But she was wise. She was so wise. And every time I got to go see her, I was always, I just loved sitting with her. And the older I got, the more I was like, wow, she's amazing. And
Mhm.
she was about 98 years old. And I went back to New York to visit her. And we were sitting in her room, and she was very routine. She had her Jack Daniels on the rocks pretty much every afternoon, one or two of them. And I was just like, I felt off. I was just really kind of struggling with who I was, and,
Mhm.
really I was at a crossroads in my life, and she was just like, basically, to paraphrase, get my shit together. I come from a long line of amazing women, and just be myself, like,
Mhm.
it was the pep talk.
Mhm.
And it was
Well,
like,
that's a really nice pep talk. You just kind of narrow it down to, just a few words, get your shit together. I remember one time when I was in college, my mother bought me a poster. Back then, posters were the big thing. And the poster was literally, get thy shit together.
I love it. Yeah, and she didn't say it quite like that, but she was just like, and she was telling me the story. So my grandfather had passed away in the early 80s, and this was 30 years later, and he was really concerned how was she going to live on her own? Excuse me. How is she going to take care of the house, blah blah blah. She sips her drink. She's like, I've done okay. Excuse me. And then, her sister blazed a totally different trail. She was the first female engineer for Lockheed.
Jeez.
She was the only woman on the Skunk Works project, which eventually sent a man to the moon. Most of her work is still classified. She was just an incredibly intelligent engineer, and she lived out in California in San Jose, and they both lived to almost 100. Neither one of them made it, but they were within months
Mhm.
of their 100th birthday, and they both lived independently. They were sharp as a tack. I mean, their strength and intelligence, and all the women in my family are educated. None of the
Mhm.
men have college degrees. They're educated, but they don't have college degrees, but
Mhm.
all the women do.
Mhm.
And that's true now.
So this was back at a time where, even just being an engineer as a woman or even considering going into
Mhm.
engineering, you would probably be laughed at.
Right? Well, it was World War II. So,
Oh, right.
she had an opening, and she took it.
Right.
And then they realized, God, she's brilliant. She was, the first Native American female engineer, a hidden figure, and she's
Mhm.
an abacus. Um, and I remember I went to my first powwow with
Mhm.
my Aunt Gold,
Mhm.
and, it was just, she was so just tall. I remember her just being very tall and striking, and having this energy and this presence, and, just very confident. And yeah, I
Mhm.
probably couldn't have told you that was confident when I was a little girl, but she just had
Mhm.
the way she carried herself. I
Mhm.
really appreciated that, and I was like, "Well, that's pretty cool. I got a lot of cool women
Mhm.
in my family." And those are then my aunts and my mom gave me different generational gifts for sure.
Mhm. Well, and I think you've carried that line. You're continuing the line because you are an incredibly strong and powerful woman.
Thank you.
I don't know if you realize it.
Probably not. I'm just trying to figure it out most of the time.
Well, like all of us. So when did you decide that it was time to start this community? And I absolutely love the name, The Fire Insider.
Well, right before my personal and professional life exploded and kind of
Mhm.
blew up, I was struggling, and I've always been able to write my way through bumpy times. I started journaling when I was about 14 years old, and I never stopped. I've always been a writer. It's how I articulate how I feel and kind of get that perspective just by putting it on the page. And so, blogging, this was 2014, blogging was pretty popular. And I thought, I'll just start a blog. How fun would that be? And I came up with the name, The Fire Insider. I bought the domain, and then everything exploded, blew up, and I didn't really write. I didn't do anything with the domain, the blog, nothing for several years. And then I didn't write for a long time either. I had someone read all my journals and really violated that trust, for me, and it really, really was very damaging to my psyche and to, everything already being down. And when I finally started writing again, I was like, "You know what? I am gonna start this blog." And that's really where the fire inside her came from. And I wrote my way initially just through healing. I wrote
Mhm.
my way, I would write stories about what I've learned and where I was at, and it was so therapeutic. And when I
Mhm.
realized, I started an email list that people liked reading what I had to say, and it resonated with other women. And I
Mhm.
was like, well, community's always been so important to me. I've had my fire community, I have my friend
Mhm.
community, my family community. I'm like, I wonder what about a community of just other women, and there are some men in the community,
Mhm.
who are kind of going through all these changes in life and these transitions, and that's really the genesis of it.
Mhm. So when you started the community, did it just start as, this online thing, like with the blogs, the stories? Did it then transition into coaching or, your followers contributing as well? What's going on with that? How's that
Um,
working?
I it's still growing.
Mhm.
So, yes, I definitely it's primarily online. I have, growing my community, my email list. The podcast was another way to just kind of get the message out there and
Mhm.
continue to grow it. Ideally, my goal is to start a membership community where, we can all
Mhm.
gather and
Mhm.
navigate these changes together.
Mhm.
My entire life, most of my life, I've been in a leadership role, whether
Mhm.
formally or informally. And so it was a very natural transition to get a coaching certificate and kind of formalize that with all the coaching and mentoring I'd been doing.
Mhm.
And then I realized that there was this huge gap of people taking care of themselves.
Mhm.
And, really, I was like, I need to focus on self care, not just for me, but
Mhm.
for other women and men who are in this middle of life. And it's a sandwich, it's kind of a shit
Mhm.
sandwich. There's storm clouds above you, alligators below you, dealing with parents aging.
Mhm.
We're aging, and then kids and grandkids. And, there's just so much. It's easy to get spread so thin. And then going back to playing small and, self-care is this
Mhm.
luxury, afforded
Mhm.
to, maybe a pedicure once in a while or,
Mhm.
a massage. And I'm like, no, self-care needs to be incorporated into your everyday life. And so that's really, just sharing different ways to build more capacity to, it's okay to be selfish. Like
Mhm.
that's gotten a bad word.
Mhm.
No, it's not a bad rap. It's selfish is okay because if you're gonna continually fill everyone else's cup, you need a pitcher
Well, and
to
I
pour
I
from.
really believe that, self-care is not selfish or being selfish. And that's what I think the stigma had been for a very long time that, oh, you're just pampering yourself. You're putting everybody else's needs, to the side and putting yourself first. And it's like, yeah. And I
Yeah,
haven't done that for the past 50 years. I think it's time.
exactly, and it's liberating, and and
Mm-hmm.
it's not like, yes, those, pedicures are great and massages and facials, but I talk about self-care as like building capacity in your life,
Mm-hmm.
setting boundaries, managing your time and your energy,
Mm-hmm.
connection, doing what brings you joy, and, being consistent with that. And it's hard. I
Mm-hmm.
fall on it. Like I'm like, I should probably follow my own advice sometimes.
Mm-hmm. I know.
Um because we're human. So it requires an incredible amount of grace. And I
Mm-hmm.
just, I think of like my grandma, my aunts, my, and not just the females, but the males in my family too, that just gave and gave and gave and never took
Mm-hmm.
care of themselves. I mean, my dad is the perfect example of it too. He was such a giver, in his way, and he made sure that everyone else was taken care of. He never took care of himself, and then he couldn't overcome his health challenges.
Mm-hmm.
He just didn't take care of himself. And after he retired, you worked so hard to enjoy retirement, he couldn't really do much,
Mm.
and, passed away, not healthy.
Well, you need self-care when you are in a perpetual state of exhaustion.
Yeah,
That would
burnout.
be, I think, the first red flag. And that's,
Mhm.
I catch myself doing that. And I have recently, I think it was just yesterday or the day before, decided, okay, this is what's going to get cut. Because
Mhm.
at this point, I cannot do everything and do everything to the level or capacity that I want to. So something's got to give. And I was
Right, and
actually kind of proud of myself.
that's awesome. And again, as women, that's a conflicting message, right? Because we were
Yes.
raised and it's like this obligation. We were told we could do anything. And,
Hmm.
the generations before us fought so hard to give us these rights. So, this
Hmm.
pressure of having to be a successful professional and a
Hmm.
kick ass mom and a good daughter and a
Hmm.
good wife and a good partner, man, you can't give 100% to everything. And
Right.
I think it's this myth, and, when I say it, that's been the hardest transition for me,
Hmm.
is to walk away from a career that I loved for a long
Hmm.
time to transition into something else that was less stressful, less,
Hmm.
so I could have more time because I wasn't giving my focus to the things that I loved. I can be
Hmm.
replaced at work. Everyone can be replaced at work.
Hmm.
Can't be replaced for your family.
So I want to go back to your career as a firefighter because,
Mhm.
as you said, you're, in a leadership role, in a lot of different areas. How in the world did that work? Being in a leadership role at the firehouse with a bunch of men who were kind of like rolling their eyes and poo-pooing you the whole time.
It was fantastic. I really did not have, I would say, the exception were the men rolling their eyes. The majority were the greatest guys I could have asked for. And when I first got promoted, a mentor of mine told me, "Just be yourself and then they will find you." Kind of like
Mhm,
that, if you build it, they will come.
mhm,
And so I did that. I was just myself. I was awkward. I, was silly, and I'd say the wrong thing sometimes, and I would make mistakes and I would fail, and I would be accountable to that, and I would, communicate well and just try to, build a successful team, a team that where we loved each other. And really that's where I learned to lead into. I learned how to love the people that I lead. And I
mhm,
didn't always like them or agree with them. I didn't always, think that they were making the best choices outside of work. But I loved them, and I made sure they felt that and that they knew, because I wanted them to be seen for who they were and the value that they added to working together. I didn't
mhm,
want a bunch of people nodding their heads saying, "Yes, ma'am, I'll do this, I'll do that."
mhm,
I wanted disruptors. I wanted to just surround myself with that. So really that became so much fun.
mhm.
Being in charge was a lot of fun. And I used to say there was no glass ceiling in the fire service because we were all paid the same. Whatever
Oh.
rank you were at, you were paid the same. However, the caveat to that is the glass ceiling became the higher up I went when people were selected for jobs. It
Mm.
was, it was hard to overcome that.
Mhm,
And so it it was so much fun. I miss that probably the most. Just
mhm,
the ability to surround myself with great guys. And the ones that didn't agree with how I led and the way I did things left, and that was totally fine.
mhm. Nice. Gotta love
Mhm.
that. So let me see, where was I going with this? I'm going back to that leadership role. With your experience as a leader, how did those skills then just kind of like transfer over to developing that community of the fire inside her?
Um, it's been harder than I thought. However, well, and it's like transferring that to being an entrepreneur, really, like,
Mhm,
and being my own boss and working for myself, and then, not always having someone to, bounce ideas off of, creating a new
mhm,
community. I think
mhm,
the best way that it transferred over is that I have learned that I can do hard things, that I can
mm,
get through the bumps, that I have the tools that I need, even without the answers or the roadmap or the guarantees. I can handle tough situations. And
mhm,
that, that comes from within. And I had to learn that as a boss, as a leader in the fire service,
mhm,
horrible things, tragic things. And so it gives me perspective of, so my first launch didn't go well. Nobody died. No one lost their home. No one's
mhm.
sick or injured. I can go back and figure this out.
Mhm. When you're dealing with critical situations, life and death,
Mhm,
the pressure's on,
mhm.
and we don't always get things exactly the way we want them to be.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and you can't always control the outcome. I think maybe that's the other gift that I have received from, life in general is that
Mhm.
there's little we can control. We say it all the time. It's very cliche, but I've
Mhm.
experienced that you can do everything right and people may die, and you can
Mhm.
do everything right and they still may not make choices that are the best for them.
Mhm.
And you can't control that. And you just have to
Mhm.
let that go.
It's hard. It is definitely hard.
Yes, yes, and I still like I said, I'm still practicing that, it's
Mhm.
the, setting the rocks down I don't need to carry anymore. Some of those rocks I've been carrying for so long, I don't even know they're rocks.
Mhm. Mhm. I know, until you get rid of them.
Right, and then you're like, "Oh, wow, okay."
Boy, I feel lighter now.
Exactly.
Okay, so now let's talk about my best or, another this is a favorite topic of mine. You are writing a book.
I am. Yes.
When did you decide it was time to put all of this between the pages of a book?
I've been saying it for years. It's one of those things like,
Mhm.
I wanna write a book. I've been writing, as I said, in a journal consistently since 14, but even beyond that, I was always writing, I was always reading. My mom I would write on books, I would write on walls. I've just always loved to write. And so, I was like, I just need to have the courage. I joined a writing kind of group
Mhm.
last fall and I just would write every day. And it reignited this love that I have for writing. And I thought, well, why not put it all in a book? And write my way through it again, right? And just,
Mhm.
and really kind of incorporate all these generational gifts in my story through the fire service in how that can, kind of hopefully resonate with other people that, we can't always determine the circumstances we're dealt in life.
Mhm.
And we can, however, learn how to navigate through them.
Mhm. Well, you certainly have plenty of material for a book. I would imagine that you have enough for several,
Probably so.
but you gotta start somewhere, right?
Exactly, exactly. So I thought I'd start with the most current, and that is, my journey through the fire service.
Mhm. Mhm. So, are you going to include any of your personal life, or would that be a different book?
You know, a little bit of it sprinkled
Mhm.
through, because
Mhm.
it can't, they're all so intertwined and
Mhm.
connected. There are parts of my story that I struggle giving page space to some of the people involved, quite honestly.
Oh, I totally understand. Yeah.
They don't deserve it. And
No.
I have a almost 12-year-old son, and have to think in 5 years, if he were to read it, how would that sound to him?
Right.
And so, I'm mindful of all of that. So yes, my personal life, there are definitely a lot of lessons learned from my personal life. I we talked about this before I could do a whole book on how not to date. Um, and for the most part, could be anonymous and quite
Mhm.
entertaining. But yeah, there are definitely bits of my personal life because that's the authentic piece. It's just
Mhm.
part of who I am.
So, why do you think that people do not live authentically? Does this go back into the box?
Yeah, it's the way they've been labeled or raised
Mhm.
or, fear. It's that scarcity mindset. Like, if I do
Mhm.
this, what will happen? If I speak my truth, if I live my truth, if I
Mhm.
follow this passion that I have, oh my God, will I no longer be successful? It's how do you define success? And it's really, I think it requires healing a lot of your own story and your
Mhm.
trauma that we all have. It's cleaning up, it's that you didn't put the trash in your front yard, but it's your responsibility to clean it up.
Mhm.
So it's really, taking that deep dive and knowing or making sure that when you do that deep dive, you're surrounded and held
Mhm.
by love and a community that, can keep you safe. And it's baby steps. I don't think anyone
Mhm.
wakes up and is like, I've always wanted to move to London and, do
Mhm.
this. And I've never traveled outside of the state. I mean, I feel like
Mhm.
there's definitely baby steps, and
Right.
you build that tolerance, right? You build
Mhm.
that capacity by doing small but consistent steps to, lead towards that authentic life. And it's messy and it's bumpy, and sometimes you get stuck in a pothole
Mhm.
for a long time. But it's worth it, because I always think, and I'm sure you can speak to this, when you see someone at the end of their life
Mhm.
and you really think of, what is it, or ask them what mattered, it's usually not, you know, that I had a really big house with a gourmet
Mhm.
kitchen.
Mhm.
It's the, connection that you have with people and to yourself.
Mhm. So now in this community, do you do like individual coaching? How does that work?
I just, it's crazy that you asked that. I thought, yes, exactly what I'm gonna do, but it was hard. And then I was like, oh, well, maybe I'm not meant to do that. And then I have been asked to put together a proposal to do some. So yes, that's the answer. I do like the individual coaching. I
Mhm.
think when it comes to learning how to take care of yourself and
Mhm.
really connect with your authenticity, it needs to be done one-on-one. It's hard to
Mhm.
do it in a group setting because
Mhm.
the group
Mhm.
think and the biases, and it's really hard to
Right.
have that connection. So yes, I do. I have a 3-month program that is all about balanced life on purpose, and really kind of it's holistic. It
Mhm.
incorporates the elements: earth, air, water, and fire,
Of
and
course. Yeah.
just a really, step by step of how you
Mhm.
can focus on your strengths. And really, it's before you focus on anything else, it's really leaning into who you are and what you want to
Mhm.
be.
Beautiful. So, where can people find you? How can they connect with you if they want to do like a consultation or whatever? Just give us that information. Of course, it's in the show notes, but I like for the guests to articulate it.
Absolutely. Well, you can go to my website, thefireinsideher.com, and there you can there's a contact form that you can fill out and connect with me that way. There's also LinkedIn, which we can put the link in the show notes.
Mhm.
And my podcast, obviously, The Fire Inside Her, and really my email newsletter, which I send out twice a month, is at thefireinsideher.com/list. And there's some resources as well if you're interested in just, to kind of see how my brain works, and how I, focus and frame things.
Mhm. Well, do you have any final like pearl of wisdom that you would like to leave with the listeners before we sign off?
Oh man. I think that what we've said, self-care is not selfish, and, life is short, and
Hmm.
just waking up every day, taking a deep breath and being like, what can I do today to
Hmm.
make me happy?
Hmm. Beautiful. Diane, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Cheryl. It was wonderful.
It was wonderful, and we really need to get together again and do another one of those 2-hour coffees or lunch or something someday soon.
Agreed.
Okay. Everybody, thank you so much for listening. Oh my goodness, so much wonderful information and insights in this episode. And do remember, yeah, think outside the box, get outside the box, break through those walls. You can do it. And remember, most of all, that self care is not selfish. And that is the way of the Femininja.